Our speaker today is a master gardener who tends roses at Charlotte Hall. Her own gardens are in Prescott Valley and Phoenix. For most of her life, she's tended roses in San Francisco, Napa Valley, Arizona, and even Vermont. Please welcome, to tell us all about roses, ELane. Thank you for being here.
I'm going to go ahead and share my screen at this point so that I can put up my slide presentation. And we're going to be covering just some of the basics about roses. So let's see if we're in screen share mode yet. I think we are. And I think this is what we want to share. Okay. So we're going to try this. Share.
We got it.
Got it. Okay. And there we are in full screen. That should be it. Yes?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
All right, good. Well, as Ferda said, my name is ELane, and I'm a Master Gardener volunteer for the Yavapai County Cooperative Extension, and I'm also a volunteer at Charlotte Hall Museum, where I do have the distinct pleasure of tending to the roses there, and we just have a lot of fun. It's a great organization, and I'm really happy to be a part of it. Over the years, I've raised and cared for a lot of roses in a range of wildly different situations, climates, including the San Francisco Bay Area and the Napa Valley. In addition to Charlotte Hall, I currently garden with roses in both Prescott Valley and the intermediate desert area just north of Phoenix. So it's not raining where I am right now. It's quite sunny, as a matter of fact. And I would like you to send the rain here, please, when you're done with it, because we could really use them. Most people think that roses are fussy and hard to care for, but in reality, they're pretty tough and actually quite hard to kill. There was an ancient Greek philosopher who once recommended pruning your rose bushes by setting them on fire. So if they can survive that, they can pretty much survive anything. Now, my goal today, let me see if I get my slides going here. There we go. My goal today is to help you select the right roses for your garden and to give you the information that allows you to select, plant, maintain, and enjoy roses as a feature in your garden with confidence and ease. I've also put together 2 handouts, which are available in PDF format, I believe. Right, Stephen? On your website?
Yes, they are. They're on the website.
Okay. I highly encourage you to download those. One has information on pruning, fertilizing, and irrigation, along with a rose garden calendar that's specific to our area. And the other has a presentation outline along with a list of resources and websites to help you with obtaining and caring for your roses. And if you decide that you'd like to explore varieties beyond what's available locally at the nurseries, you'll find the website information for heirloom roses, antique rose emporium, and David Austin roses under resources in the presentation handout also. And you'll also see a link for sites like helpmefind.com, the American Rose Society, and other rose groups. And these sites offer a wealth of information, not only on how to grow your roses, but also reviews from gardeners from all over the world on all sorts of rose varieties. So I really recommend looking at that. Now let's get to the fun part. There are literally thousands of wonderful varieties to choose from, but the American Rose Society has broken this vast number down into basically 2 classes. Old roses are roses introduced before 1967, which was when La France, which is the first hybrid tea, which there's a little debate about, but we're going to just go with that. And so anything after La France from 1867 on is considered a modern rose. Now, old roses tend to have more fragrance than their modern counterparts, and they're generally very hardy and disease resistant. They do tend to be either once blooming through the spring or summer season, and they might have a slight rebloom towards the fall, which modern roses kind of have an advantage with the repeat blooming, but they often lack the fragrance and the charm of some of the older varieties. So I kind of like to mix the older with the newer. It's kind of nice. You get a nice balance that way. There have been improvements to the disease resistance and fragrance in some of the modern roses over the last few decades. Species roses, which are sort of a category of their own, although they're often lumped together with old roses, include a variety called Rosa Woodsii, which you can see at the bottom left photo of this slide. And that is native to Arizona, and it's very drought resistant once it's established. So if you're a native plant gardener, it could be a nice addition for you. And I do believe that a native gardener has that rose. They usually carry it. Cold hardy roses are another idea. There are many different roses that were bred specifically for cold climates to choose from, which is good for those of you who live at the higher elevations. Dr. Griffith Buck bred roses in the 1970s specifically to withstand the cold, harsh winters of Iowa with no protection. If they couldn't survive that, he didn't bring it to market. And Dr. and Mrs. Walter Brownell came before him, developing their Sub-Zero line of roses in Rhode Island in the 1920s to the 1950s. Laughter, which we see here, is probably the most famous of the Brownell roses. Old garden roses, except for Chinas and teas, also do really well in cold weather. Chinas and teas don't grow in Prescott. Species roses are good too, like Banksia. And in modern roses, look for varieties from Cordis, Tantau, and David Austin. And they all do really well in the cold. Microclimates are important too. Your particular microclimate is also an important factor when you're deciding what roses you're going to put in your yard. When you select a rose, you want to note the hardiness rating, which, as you probably know, being gardeners, is basically how much cold the plant can withstand. And we're not worried about heat here. Roses love heat. As most of you probably know, Prescott area is pretty much in USDA zone 7A to 7B, and some of the lower, warmer elevations, like Prescott Valley, where this picture was taken, border on zone 8A. The higher the elevation, generally the cooler the temp, and the lower your zone number. And you may also be in a little warm or cool spot, depending on your topography and exposure in the mountains. Many modern roses will be rated for zone 5 or above, and most old garden roses are also suitable for our climate. All roses require a minimum of 6 hours a day of direct sunlight to do well. And you can get by with less with some of them, but they won't reach their full potential with growth or blooms. If you're at a higher elevation, cold hardiness will be more of a consideration. So you might want to think about planting your roses in a location with a southern rather than a northern exposure, or if you have a area that's kind of a sun trap against the wall. And the bottom line is, before you decide where to plant your roses, spend a little time in your garden and pay attention to where the sunniest and the warmest spots are. Moving on to rose selection, let's talk about quality first. This is very important when you're selecting your rose, and the old adage, you get what you pay for, is very true, especially when it comes to choosing a plant that you may have in your garden for many years to come. Roses can live a very long time. So you want to spend a bit more up front and get the best quality plant, because that's going to give you the best long-term yield. You're going to have a hardy, beautiful specimen that brings you many years of enjoyment. So I know it's tempting, but don't buy things that look like these pictures. Skip the bargain roses that come with pre-existing conditions, like paraffin dip canes, which is on the left there. That'll just fry in our intense sun, or roots that have been folded into plastic bags like origami, and they might be completely bug dried out. You'll spend more time and money trying to nurse these along than you'll save, and then you're just going to end up being frustrated and think that roses are hard to do and too fussy, which would really be too bad, because nothing could be further from the truth. They are so not fussy and hard to grow. Buy from your local nursery or a reputable mail order or online source, because when you do that, you're usually not only getting a superior plant, but you're also going to get ongoing support from people who want to see you succeed. David Austin Roses offers a 5-year guarantee on their roses that you order from them, and free planting and garden design advice from a little guy in England. Antique Rose Emporium and Heirloom Roses both offer a 1-year guarantee on their roses and send planting instructions with them, and they're also happy to offer advice. And of course, our local independent nurseries are usually quite eager to help us succeed too, and they usually have qualified staff, and they want you to become a repeat customer. So skip the big boxes, I guess is what I'm saying. Moving on, another thing that you'll need to think about is the differences between the way that roses are produced and which type makes the most sense for you to buy. Own root roses are roses that are grown from cuttings, which are taken from the parent plant, and are on their own roots, not grafted onto rootstock. A bare root rose is a rose that is sold in its dormant stage with no soil around its roots. Bare root roses are usually grafted onto rootstock, but they may also be sold as own root, and they're graded by the number of their canes, with 1 being the best and having the most canes, the most mature, and 2 being the least desirable. And there's a 1.5 in the middle there. And you really want to purchase grade 1 plants when you're buying bare roots. Most of the roses that are sold potted up in containers are also going to be grafted roses, with some exceptions, like species roses and Banksias and so forth. And then, of course, grafting refers to inserting a cutting or a scion into a cut made in the rootstock stem, wrap it with grafting tape to hold it in place until it takes, and then the bud union is the point where the scion was grafted to the rootstock. Now, since the only roses that will sprout from seed are species roses, all hybridized roses have to be reproduced by either grafting or by rooting cuttings from the parent plant, which is called asexual reproduction. You could take the seeds from a hybrid rose, plant them, and every one that sprouted would be something different from the parent plant, and probably none of them would be the same as each other either. So the main differences between grafted and own root boil down to this. Grafting is a much cheaper, faster, and surer method for a grower to produce a large number of plants for market. So the majority of the roses sold at retailer grafted plants. And in the western half of the United States, including here, Dr. Huey is the preferred rootstock used by growers for disease resistance and hardiness. But he can be a rather aggressive fellow, as you can see from this picture, and he has an unfortunate tendency to take over the scion by throwing out suckers from below the bud union. And if he's left unchecked, he'll take over the entire plant like he is doing here, and he will eventually kill off the scion, leaving you with a beautiful Dr. Huey rose. And that's exactly what happened. I had to actually remove this rose eventually. So an important part of maintaining a grafted rose is to remove any suckers that appear below the bud union. The other danger with the young grafted rose is that the scion is going to be considerably weaker than the rootstock for a period of time. And if there's a big cold snap or other calamity that weakens the scion would pass the point of no return, you're also going to end up with Dr. Huey. Kind of pretty red though. Own root roses, by contrast, are produced by root cuttings taken from the mother plant, and they're grown on their own roots, as we already said. That's the term own root. And if you've ever tried to root rose cuttings, you can imagine this is a much longer process with a lower success rate and a longer production time than grafting. Also, own root roses by their very nature must be container grown. So own roots tend to be more expensive. They can't just heal a whole bunch of them into a big bed and then yank them when they're ready to ship them. But in my opinion, they're also just so much more worth it. They're more disease resistant, they're cold hardy because there's no vulnerable bud union. And if somebody runs over them with a lawnmower or a snowblower and it's killed back by the cold, what will spring back up from the roots will be the rose that you want, and not the rootstock. And of course, you don't have to pull suckers either from below the graft union on own root. Now, own root roses tend to be sold as smaller 1-year-old plants, as opposed to grafted plants, which are generally sold as larger 2- and 3-year-olds. But an own root rose will catch up in growth to the larger grafted rose within a year and surpass it in 2. In my book, it's worth the wait. Now let's talk about considering whether to plant bare root roses or container roses. And when you're thinking about this, it's worth noting that containerized roses can be planted at any time of the year, whereas bare root roses should be planted as soon as possible after the last hard frost, which lately with the weather has been debatable what that's going to be. Once again, most bare root roses are grafted stock and more mature and tend to be less expensive than the containerized roses. And there's also a wide variety of roses beyond your basic hybrid teas that are available in containers from websites and mail order, and then some of your local retailers too. Sorry about that, everybody. Now we're back. Okay, so now that we've gotten all excited about all of the different varieties of amazing, beautiful roses we can plant, let's talk about how to care for them so that you're going to have happy, healthy plants that bring many years of stress-free enjoyment. We're going to start with the literal foundation of a vigorous, trouble-free rose, which is planting it in good soil. Roses like a nice, balanced soil with a pH of around 6 to 6.5. Unfortunately, soils in our area tend to have a pH of 7 to 7.8, if you have soil and not just granite. As you may know, soil with a pH at or above 7.5 typically has a higher calcium concentration, which makes phosphorus unavailable to plants. And of course, phosphorus is when we get the lovely blooms, right? If you aren't sure what your soil's pH is, you can have it tested through the Yavapai Extension Office. And due to the COVID situation, please call ahead to the Extension Office before bringing in a soil sample. The contact information is on the presentation and resources handout that I mentioned earlier. It's also important to understand the composition of your soil. The ideal soil is a third compost, a third sand, and a third loam. And if you have this perfect combination, you're very lucky. Most of us, however, don't. We have local soils, which are usually sandy loam, clay, or possibly sandy decomposed granite, my favorite. So most of us are going to have to amend what we've got, adding things like feather meal for nitrogen, sulfur to lower the pH, and any trace minerals that our soil might be deficient in. Earthworm castings are as good, if not better, for the soil than compost, and adding some actual earthworms to your soil is the most amazing thing that you can do for it. And I think Curtis can vouch for that. If sandy decomposed granite lurks in your yard, you're going to need to amend it with a third compost and 2/3 good quality topsoil. And that can be obtained at Waters, or at Prescott Dirt also has some nice stuff they dredge out of Willow Lake. Clay soils can be amended with organic matter like compost, and compost or clay will provide aeration and give the plant the water nutrient holding ability it's going to need. A word on manure: be careful with using manure as an amendment. If you're going to do it, only use manure that's been well aged, which means that it's been leached with water to remove the salts, and till it into an appropriate depth, usually 6 to 8 inches. And do this about 6 months before you plant. Do it in the fall if you're going to plant in the spring. It's really not necessary to amend with manure, and using it improperly can result in salt burn to your plants. The Extension Lab office, again, has a lot of different resources for labs that will perform other soil tests to determine exactly what your soil quality is. And it's a very good idea to have more than just the pH tested if you've never done so before, because then you can fix exactly what you need to with your soil instead of just guessing and wasting your money on amendments that don't fix what the real problem is. And there's a link to Texas A&M on that resources handout. They do a very affordable soil test. I don't know what the situation is now with COVID, but last I checked a year or so ago, it was about $12 to $15 to have them test your soil. So I think they're well worth it. And then let's see if I can get this going again, because it looks like we're once again having a little issue with the, okay, there we go. All right, planting your roses. Now we've got the soil prepared. Knowing how to plant your rose correctly is the next step towards success. We're going to talk about planting bare root and containerized roses, but we're going to start with the bare roots. First, you're going to remove any packaging, and you're going to soak that bare root plant in a bucket of water overnight, or up to 24 hours. And it gets the roots nice and hydrated and plump before planting when you do that. Next thing you're going to do is amend the soil with a cup of super triple phosphate, because that promotes root and shoot growth. And you're only going to add sulfur if your soil needs it. And you're going to dig a hole as deep and as wide as the roots, which is roughly 18 to 30 inches. And if you have 1 or 2 roots that are kind of longer and twanging off in another direction, you can chop them with your pruners, but don't go too crazy with that. Then you're going to build a cone of soil in the middle of your planting hole, and you're going to position the rose over that cone, and you're going to make sure that the crown, if it's own root, or the bud unit if it's grafted, is just above the soil level, and drape the roots over the cone of soil and backfill with the rest of the soil. And then water it thoroughly to get rid of any air pockets around the roots so it can take up the water. And then you're going to gently, with your hands, do not step on it, please, gently firm the soil around it. And mulch. Mulch is your friend. Please, please, please put a good 3 to 4 inches of mulch around the base of that rose, not right up against the bud union or the crown, because this is going to help retain the soil moisture in the summer and insulate them from winter cold. And I like to use pine shavings sold for animal bedding at Tractor Supply. They're very cheap and they're very effective. Let's move on to planting roses that are containerized, come potted up in containers. This one's really easy. Just make sure that your soil is properly amended, add anything that's lacking, and then dig a hole as deep and twice as wide as the roots and soil in the pot, and kind of rough up the sides of that hole so the little roots have little crevices and cracks to get into. Gently remove the rose from its container and place in the hole, making sure that the bud union or crown, again, is just above grade. And you're going to backfill it again, firming around the edges with your hands, no stepping on it, and water it in thoroughly. And don't forget to mulch. Now that we've got a roses planted, maintaining them is the next step, and maintaining them is actually fairly simple. Irrigate consistently, prune yearly, deadhead and fertilize regularly during the bloom cycle period, control pests as needed, and keep them mulched. We're lucky in Prescott to have very little in the way of pests and diseases common to roses, and we've got nice dry air, which keeps the mildew, the powdery mildew, to a minimum, and our only real big issue is the cold of the winter. And I'm going to read you a quote from Dr. Griffith Buck, who once said, remember, he's the guy in Iowa that bred those plants that could survive a winter there with no protection. And he once said, preparation of a plant for winter begins not in the late fall, but in the early spring. The degree of maturity that allows a plant to survive the winter is directly related to the quality of cultivation it received during the growing season. The goal is a steady growth rate through the growing season with a careful cessation from mid-August until a killing frost. So let's talk about each of these steps for good cultivation in more detail. With roses, consistent water applied in correct quantities, neither too much nor too little, is crucial. Roses are high water users, so think about your water bill before you go hog wild, with the exception of established species roses, which need little water once they're established. The best way to ensure your rose gets the right amount of water without stress or salt built up, which occurs with the high mineral content of both the water and soil in our area, is to water to a 2 to 3 foot depth. The best way to accomplish this 2 to 3 foot depth is with drip irrigation. Once again, mulching will really help to retain moisture in the soil. And Steve, I know you hand water all yours, which I can't even imagine. Water requirements will vary with weather, soil, and microclimate, but a good general guide is 3 to 4 gallons of water per rose 3 to 4 times a week in the summer, 2 to 3 times a week in the fall and spring, and once a week or less in the winter. And actually, we turn the irrigation on the rose garden at Charlotte Hall off in the winter because you don't want to get root rot going either. But again, climate has been changing and doing interesting things, so that's something that we're sort of adjusting on an ongoing basis. Roses in pots or other containers will need to be watered more frequently, of course. So that's pretty much it for irrigation. And then once your roses are blooming, deadheading is an important part of the maintenance routine during that period in spring and fall. So deadheading, of course, is the removal of the spent flowers, and that's the secret to getting repeat bloom on most roses. And there are a few varieties out there like carpet roses, the oh so easy stuff that are self-cleaning. But for most roses, if you don't remove the spent blooms, they're going to form hips and they're not going to rebloom as well. You always want to use bypass pruners when deadheading, not anvil style, because those will crush and damage the stems. And on hybrid teas, you're going to want to, when you're deadheading, go down the stem to the second or third 5-leaf leaflet with an outside bud eye, meaning that the bud is facing, you can see a little tiny piece of green between the stem and that leaf and the leaf axil that's going to become a new shoot. And you want one that's facing outwards away from the rose because you don't want to prune your rose or deadhead your rose so you've got things growing into the middle of it. And once you've located that outside bud eye with the 5-leaf leaflet attached, use a sharp pair of bypass pruners and make a cut about 1/4 inch above the bud eye at a 45-degree angle. The low side of the angle should be on the opposite side of the bud eye. This is going to cause the sap to run back down the back of the cane so that it won't cover the bud eye and impede any new growth there. And you want the remaining stem to be at least pencil thick so that it can support the next bloom it's going to put out. And you can cut longer stems for the house for a bouquet, but just remember that the farther down you cut on a hybrid tea stem, the longer it will take for that stem to rebloom. About 5 days longer for every 5 leaflet you go down. So don't also cut off stems of new bushes that are small because it might stunt their growth. So, shorter stems are better unless you're doing a bouquet. For floribundas, you're going to deadhead at the first appropriate 5-leaflet group below the start of the bloom spray, meaning with an outside eye. And on miniature roses, you're going to deadhead just below the bloom unless you're trying to shorten or shape the bush. Miniatures, I'm talking really small, I'm talking like 12 inches. I'm talking the real mini minis. For climbers, you're also just going to deadhead right behind the bloom. And don't worry too much about an outward facing bud eye on your climbers. And if your lateral shoots on the climber get too long and aren't going the way you want them, you can cut them back by 8 to 12 inches, and this will also encourage rebloom during the blooming season. On your English shrub roses and old garden roses, try not to take long stems. Just let them go through a bloom cycle and snip off spent flowers just behind the bloom or a little longer if you want flowers again for a bouquet. And after the bush is bloomed out for the first flush, cut all of the laterals back 8 to 12 inches, which tends to encourage another large rebloom. I ignore my own advice on my Austin roses and I just deadheaded an outside 5, but to each their own. And you might want to shape your shrub roses a bit midsummer by cutting them back by 1/3. And this will cause a flush of new blooms in the fall. And in the Prescott area, don't deadhead after September. We don't at Charlotte Hall. And the reasoning is it allows the plant to put its energies into preparing its roots for the winter instead of supporting more tender new growth and blooms that deadheading promotes. You really want to let your plants kind of go to sleep for a nap for the winter. So don't force them to produce more tender growth at that point. Now to everybody's favorite subject, the thorny subject, is a subject that scares a lot of people, pruning roses. It's actually pretty straightforward. And if you've pruned any sort of woody perennial, it's really not that different. You just really want to wear some good gloves is all. Roses should be pruned annually, and the best time to tackle the annual rose pruning in our area is from mid-March to early April. Keep an eye on the weather and aim for pruning hopefully after the last major cold snap and before the rose starts to bud out. And I'm laughing because you're having a cold snap right now. We have pruned all the roses at Charlotte Hall. This is tricky with our changing weather patterns, but I would personally rather prune a bit later than too early and risk the newly cut canes and their growth dying back from a late cold spell. If we do get a late freeze after you've pruned, it usually won't do that much harm unless the temperatures drop into the mid-20s or lower. And if that happens, just prune back the dead stuff to the next lower desirable buds. Microclimates have a very strong effect here as well. So if you're in a cooler or a warmer area, you're going to want to alter your pruning dates accordingly. Why do we prune a rose? We prune a rose to rejuvenate the plant, to eliminate unwanted growth, crossing canes, to shape a plant and to form a plant that will produce the quantity and quality of blooms that we desire. We prune to remove dead, dying, spindly, diseased canes that are going in wrong directions, to open up the center of the bush to improve air circulation in some varieties, and to train the plant in other varieties such as climbers. So next, let's talk about making that all-important cut. And this is in your handout, by the way, in the All About Roses handout. So we're going to talk about how to prune several different varieties briefly, but let's talk about this cut first. It's going to be just like when you deadhead. You're going to make your cuts to an outside bud eye at a 45-degree angle sloping away from the bud eye. And if you cut more than 1/4 inch above the bud eye, what's going to happen is the cane might die off above your cut, turning black with necrosis possibly traveling farther down the cane. On a dormant rose, and especially on older, larger canes, it can be hard to find the bud eye, so look for the upside down smile. Another thing as you're pruning, you want to pay attention to the color of the pith as you cut. You want a white, cream, or soft yellow color, which varies from rose to rose. A darker yellow or brownish color generally indicates a health issue, probably a disease condition, so you want to cut a cane like that back to healthy colored pith. Now, the tools that you're going to want to have on hand to do your pruning is the following. You're going to want a good pair of bypass hand pruners. Again, don't use anvil-style pruners or loppers because they'll crush the canes and damage the plant. Bypass loppers are good for removing the very long stuff first and for cutting thicker canes. A good pair of leather gauntlet gloves is also a must for saving your hands and arms from a thorny situation. And I also like this handy tool from Corona that I've got pictured there to the right. It's basically a light-duty bypass pruner with a grabber bit on a 3 to 4 inch foot-long stick. And the grabber lets you pull back what you cut off and not drop the litter down into the bed. And it's really useful in your annual pruning game. It's hard to reach little areas, like little spindly stuff down the middle without getting yourself cut up. And lastly, it's a good idea to have a rubbing alcohol or a bleach solution on hand to dip your tools in between rose bushes to sanitize them and help stop the spread of any disease. And this is also why you want to clean up your old leaf and twig litter as you go and not leaving it on the ground where it can cause things like powdery mildew to spread. And if you like to barbecue, you can take your trimmings, your canes and your twigs, and you can soak them in some water, and then you can add them to next to the charcoal, and they'll give whatever you're cooking a fruity, somewhat sweet taste. So there's an idea for your litter. So let's talk about pruning hybrids and grandifloras, which are fairly similar in how you go about this. In general, here we're talking about pruning roses that are at least 3 to 4 years old. In our area, hybrids and grandifloras generally grow to a height of 4 to 6 feet, and sometimes the grandifloras get taller than that. So this is where it's useful to take your loppers, so the longer canes first, so that you can work more easily before making your final cuts. Just kind of whack the top off a bit so that you can see what you got down under there. And also you're going to remove any dead leaves from last year that are still on the plant. And then start removing any dead, dying, or diseased canes and any suckers coming up from below the bud union if it is a grafted rose. If you have a young rose that's only a year or two old, this is pretty much all you're going to do for pruning, except maybe a little light shaping. On the mature plants, you want to aim for leaving 5 to 8 canes, and you want to choose the healthier, mid-sized canes, removing the older ones. Cut the older canes that you are keeping to an outside bud eye at a height of around 2 feet for hybrid teas and 4 feet for grandifloras. If there are newer, smaller canes that you would want to keep, cut those back by 1/3. And remember, fewer canes means larger but fewer flowers, and more canes means smaller but more abundant flowers. And so that's pretty much it. See, that's not so bad. It's not so hard. And the one thing is, on your canes, our cold will sometimes discolor the older canes. And so that doesn't necessarily, look at your pith to tell if the cane's healthy or not. You may want to leave the cane and it looks a little black or a little yellow or a little brown on the outside, but it's perfectly fine on the pith on the inside. And so that's fairly typical here, and it's probably a very good cane and you can leave it. So there's a little tip on that. Let's move on to pruning floribundas. Floribundas are pretty easy. You're just going to take about 1/4 off the top of the canes, leaving all the canes that aren't dead, dying, or diseased. Sometimes you might want to thin out an older floribunda bush, and it'll be necessary to remove a few older canes, but normally old canes aren't removed every year on floribundas. The canes on a floribunda are going to be smaller than on a hybrid tea or a grandiflora, so the diameter of the canes at the pruning point will likely be smaller. Polyanthas should be pruned like floribundas, and so should miniatures. And miniatures are pruned to a height of about 12 inches. And on the minis, you just clean out the dead twiggy material from the center of the bush by pruning out some of the live canes. Minis go in and out of fashion. Right now, I think they're pretty out of fashion, but they can be kind of fun to play with in pots. Okay, pruning shrub roses. Shrubs are easy too. For shrub roses like David Austin's, just remove the dead and diseased canes and twigs, any suckers if grafted, and shape as desired. And generally, you're going to take the canes back by 1/3 all the way around. Shrub roses can sprawl, so it's best to allow plenty of room for them when you plant them. Remember how big they are going to get. And please resist the urge to take hedge trimmers to your shrub or ground cover roses. I have seen people do this. They will survive, but the results won't necessarily be that pretty. On the subject of ground cover roses, they really don't need much more than a trimming to shape them in the direction you want them to go. If they look fine, leave them alone. For old garden roses, you're going to clean up the dead and twiggy material, and you're going to lightly shape the bush at pruning time and leave the more serious pruning until after the first and sometimes only bloom cycle, because a lot of them bloom on old wood. Then if more thinning or shaping is required, you can do it after that bloom cycle is complete. Excuse me for a minute. When we're doing climbers, there we go. When you're pruning climbers, we have 2 varieties to consider, repeat bloomers and once blooming varieties. The once blooming varieties flower on last year's wood, just like the older roses do, early in the season. So you're not going to prune those until the bloom is finished. For old climbers that haven't been pruned in several years, it would be advisable to remove about 1/3 to 1/2 of the oldest canes at the base. The canes or lateral branches that bloom this year should be cut back to the lowest or next lowest 5 leaflet past the blooms after the blooming's done. Canes that are trained horizontally or arched are going to produce more flowers than those left to grow straight up. So keep that in mind too when training your climbers. And canes can be trained along the surface you wish, and at the point where you want the cane to stop growing, just turn the end of it down and secure it, and horizontal growth should stop at that point. So that's kind of a nifty little tip. Repeat blooming climbers may be pruned earlier in the season before they are blooming, and they should be treated like once bloomers for removing the old canes as well. And select the canes you want to train for the current year after you prune them back, and prune back the lateral branches to a strong portion of the cane. And select a bud eye pointing in the direction that you want the rows to go. And that's pretty much it on climbers. So see, pruning's just not that scary. It's pretty straightforward. Now let's move on to taking care of your roses' nutrition needs, because this is a very important part of maintenance. So just like you need food and water, your plants and your roses need food and water. So maintaining a regular fertilizing schedule is the best way to ensure that your roses are going to get the proper nutrients so that they're going to give you lots of lovely blooms and lots of healthy foliage. And over-fertilizing can be worse than under-fertilizing, as we can see from this picture. It can lead to salt burn. So you want to keep a balanced regimen that keeps your plants on an even keel. Fertilizer may be composed of chemical or organic matter. All fertilizers will have 3 numbers on the label, which relate to the amounts of nitrogen, phosphate, and potassium, also called potash, they contain. If those 3 numbers aren't on the label, it's not fertilizer. There's a lot of people selling snake oil out there. So if it doesn't have NPK on that label, it's not fertilizer. And I'm not sure what it's going to do for your plants. so be aware of that. So when do you fertilize your roses? Don't fertilize your roses during winter dormancy, obviously. You should fertilize once a month starting in late spring, about 1 month after pruning, and through the late summer. Stop fertilizing after early September. We don't fertilize after September 1st at Charlotte Hall. This allows, again, the rose to enter dormancy gently and stop putting out all of that tender growth that could really not be good for it to have freeze off. And it lets it put its energy into the roots, which is where it needs to store starches for the winter. Okay, so we're going to stop fertilizing after early September, and late spring and early fall, we're going to spread half a cup of Epsom salts per rose bush onto the soil and water that in thoroughly. And the reason we're doing this is Epsom salts are high in magnesium, and that's a mineral that alkaline soils like ours lack, and it allows the plant to take up the nutrients. Epsom salts promote greener leaves, more blooms, and stronger canes. And you're going to watch for any nutrient deficiencies while bloom season is going on, and just in general, when we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes, and you're going to correct those as needed. When fertilizing, always follow the manufacturer's direction on the label. More is not better. As previously mentioned, sometimes too much of a good thing can end up being a very bad thing. So too much fertilizer can burn your rose and do more damage than not fertilizing at all. And while you're reading the directions on the label, look at the NPK numbers and remember that nitrogen promotes leafy growth, phosphate promotes flowers, and potassium helps the roots. In general, a fertilizer with moderate nitrogen and potassium numbers and a higher phosphate content to promote bloom is a good choice. It's a really good idea to use a fertilizer that's especially formulated for roses. And also avoid fertilizers that contain systemic insecticides. Our beneficial insects and pollinators are having a tough enough time as it is, and we don't really have serious critters or diseases here that are going to kill a plant to justify doing that. When you're applying the fertilizers to the soil, you want to mix them into the soil around the rows and water them in thoroughly if they're a powdered fertilizer. If you're using drip irrigation, apply it so the emitters can help work the fertilizer in further. In other words, put it by the emitters. And if you're going to use foliar sprays to fertilize, do so early in the morning or late in the evening when the temperatures are below 80 degrees Fahrenheit. I don't use spray fertilizers a lot. Sometimes I might use one in the evening down in my desert garden because they tend to be very much lighter in NPK, and that's a concern with the heat in the desert. But for Prescott, I really like the Dr. Earth products, which I have pictured here for the most part, and I've had very good success with them. Fertilizer can be made of chemical or organic matter, so what you use depends on your personal thoughts, I guess. Your rose really doesn't know the difference or care, but your soil might. Chemical fertilizers have more of an immediate effect on the plant, but they also dissipate from the soil very quickly. And organics are slower acting, but they stick around longer and they help improve your soil quality. So, chemicals are sort of like Doritos, and the Dr. Earth is kind of like, I don't know, organic carrots or something. And there are other brands too, like Happy Frog and so forth, with the organics that are quite good. So when you're talking about just general things with the fertilizing, when you've got too much nitrogen going on, you're going to see a burned, brittle, and dying bush. If you've got too little potassium, you're going to get curled leaves that appear burned, and you're going to get wilting blooms. And if you give too much phosphate, that leads to a zinc deficiency, which leads to an iron deficiency. And the reason we use the super triple phosphate when we plant a new rose is because it promotes the root development and the shoot development in the plant. Real quickly, we're going to cover what some of the deficiencies look like and how to tell which is which. Iron deficiency is common with our soils and is characterized by yellowing and green veins on young leaves. The cure for this is real simple. You get some chelated iron and you use it per the label instructions for roses, and that should solve your issue. A nitrogen deficiency can look an awful lot like an iron deficiency. The difference is nitrogen deficiency shows up in the older leaves first. And the reason is the plant circulatory system allows it to move nitrogen around, but it can't move iron around. So it's going to sacrifice the older leaves to give the nutrients to the newer leaves with a nitrogen deficiency is a survival mechanism. So the big problem here is the alkaline soil, and that's again why you want to fertilize with the regular amount of nitrogen that's appropriate for roses, not too much or too little. And Epsom salts, again, really do help with nutrient uptake. And that's another thing with the magnesium deficiency, which looks like this. You get these green arrow kind of things in the middle and yellow edges. And so applying your Epsom salts twice a year, half cup per plant, will solve that problem. Moving on to pests. Cutter bees are not really pests. Please leave them alone. They need those little pieces for their nests. And if you've ever seen one of these guys pirouette on a leaf and cut out a piece, it's amazing to watch. It doesn't do any damage to your plant other than cosmetic damage, and they have a pretty short season for nesting. So it's not really an issue. Spider mites appear when it gets hot and dry, and you can tell them by the bronzing of the leaves. They get kind of sticky stuff on the leaves, and sometimes there's webbing. This is not a good thing to not stay on top of. It can really damage the plant in long term. It can actually kill it if it's gone completely unchecked. Easy to handle. Insecticidal soap, or just hose them off with jets of water, and you're done. Signs of cane borer. Cane borers are little parasitic wasps. Sometimes they're sawflies and sometimes they're cutter bees, and they will bore a hole in the cane, usually a fairly larger cane that you've pruned the end of, and they'll tunnel in and lay their larvae in there, and they can wreak havoc with the rose if they work their way all the way down to the crown. So basically, you just chop off until you get down to healthy pith without a hole or without any of the larvae, which looks like black goo in it. And then you can use Elmer's wood glue. Don't use anything, Elmer's all-purpose glue. Don't use wood glue to seal the end of that if you wish, and that theoretically keeps them from boring back in. I don't do this because I've got over 300 roses and I can't paint them all with wood glue, but I just cut it off when I see it. And thrips and aphids, everybody's seen these, and the good news is ladybug larvae eat aphids, so go ladybugs. And these little guys, you can spray them off with a jet of water or spray them with insecticidal soap, and they will disappear when our weather turns warmer. So that's one nice feature about them. Powdery mildew, we don't see too much, but we see it from time to time. It's because of poor air circulation, winds, temperature fluctuations, and you'll get little blisters on the leaves, and then they'll be followed by the dreaded white powdery spots. And that's another good reason to keep your leaf litter off your beds, if at all possible, because that's one of the ways it spreads. You can treat this by either spraying it with a hard blast of water or with a fungicide, and I like to use an organic OMRI certified product. It's Safer Brands 3-in-1 garden spray. And lastly, rose mosaic disease. We don't see this too much, but every once in a while, if you're wandering around the garden center, you may see a plant with what looks like very pretty variegation on it. It is not. It's a disease, and it is not curable, and it will eventually kill the plant. It doesn't kill it for it takes a long time. This gets caused by infected stock being used at the grafting end of things. So this is another good reason to buy your roses from reputable sources. And it will spread, but I haven't really seen it spread that much. Theoretically, it could spread your other roses, but again, just don't buy that plant. Moving on to larger pests, deer. Deer love roses. They think they're very tasty. It's like a salad bar for them, and I'm sure everybody here has their battle stories with deer. Using a deer repellent spray only works if you use it consistently, and even then, maybe. And deer fencing, like we see here on the picture on the left, my dear friends, the Thornbrews, who live up by Thumb Butte, built this lovely 10-foot high enclosure for some roses I gave them. That can be a very expensive venture. Close your mouth, Steve, I see that. It's quite the thing, isn't it? And so, a cheaper alternative for deer is to create a surface that's unstable, because deer will not walk on an unstable surface. So if you take chicken wire and make a mat out of it, and you place it 1 to 2 inches off the ground with bricks, and you have to make sure you place it far enough out so their little necks, they can't lean over and still take a nibble. This will keep the deer from getting at your plants. And you can hide the ugly mess of the chicken wire and the bricks with a light dusting of mulch on top of them, or maybe you'd like to grow something dianthus or lavender or verbena that deer find absolutely appalling to their taste buds. So that is my tip of the day for deer. Then we move on to gophers. So when trapping, cayenne pepper, calling Bill Murray all fail, this might be an alternative. Raised beds lined with a material. Here I'm using a cheese grater-like material that they hang stucco off the sides of houses with. It's very, very sharp, so nothing's going to get through that without getting completely shredded. And you can also take hardware cloth if you want to do in-ground and just line your holes with the hardware cloth. Or of course they do sell the gopher cages that you can cage the root balls of your plants in too. So, and raised beds can also be helpful if you have an area that's more granite than soil, which we'll talk about in a minute or two. And now we're going to talk a little bit about landscaping with roses. Landscaping with roses is, I think, a really wonderful thing to do in your garden. I know some people think that once upon a time, someone decided that hybrid teas have to be lined up like tombstones and spaced well apart in a separate bed, and you can't have anything with them because that might cause pestilence and disease, and and actually nothing could be further from the truth. Have fun with your roses. Use them as a focal point in a beautiful pot. Grow them together with annual or perennial companion plants, or just mass a whole mess of them together like this for a stunning effect. And so here are a few other ideas for using roses in your garden. Raised beds, gophers aside, if you happen to be gardening on top of granite boulders or solid clay, like I am in Prescott Valley, that's my garden, Prescott Valley, the top photo. Raised beds can be a great way to go. They can be made out of any number of materials: wood, stone, concrete, split block, like we see in the bottom photo, old tires. Use your imagination. With the raised beds, the trick is getting good drainage. So have good topsoil brought in to fill them. Always put gravel bed down underneath them before you fill them. And do watch your moisture levels. And mulch, 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 because raised beds tend to dry out faster and get colder in the winter. Structures can also be a great way to showcase climbing roses in your garden, either as a show-stealing centerpiece or as a grounding element that maybe separates a space or marks an entrance to a garden path. And they can be as elaborate as this beautiful Peggy Martin on an umbrella tutor, or as simple as a short climber like Don Juan draped over a plain arbor with trumpet vines. Stucco or stone walls, gazebos, even large trees can be ideal places for climbers to scramble. And sending one cascading down a wall instead of up it from above is also a nice look if you have a hilly area. Pegging a rose is also sort of a fun thing to do. If you have a short climber and a bit of space, this works well, and it's a really dramatic effect. And what you do is you arch and peg seasoned canes to the ground. Emphasis on seasoned canes. If you try to do this with new canes, they will break, so use older ones. And this technique results in flowers at almost every leaf axil, which creates a literal fountain of blooms. So it's kind of a real cool thing to do if you've got the room. Roses also make great companion plants. So you might try combining them with pungent plants, as discussed, for the deer problem, or you can use annuals in front of hybrid teas or grandifloras to hide their long legs. Shorter irises are very nice for this. Or you can combine natives with interesting textures like prickly pears and yuccas and agaves with roses for a pretty cool effect. And lastly, roses are a good idea for pots. There are many, many varieties that do really well in containers. And if you've got limited space, this can be a really good way to enjoy roses. Like if you're on maybe 2 acres of downslope of granite with deer and ponderosa pine, but you've got a deck. Maybe you just want to have a really beautiful big pot as a focal point on your deck and have a rose in that. The key here is choose a pot or other container that won't crack in the cold of winter, and pick a rose that's hardy to at least 2 zones below the USDA zone that you're in, because roses in pots have less insulation from the cold and the heat in the container. So you're going to need to water them more frequently in the summer, mulch, 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 and you're probably going to have to protect them in a really bad cold spell. And again, mulch is going to be your friend with that. And that is my presentation. Thank you for putting up with me and my newbiness at the Zoom presentation. And these are some of the resources I was talking about that are also on the class handout. And if anyone has any questions, I'm more than happy to try and answer them.
I have a question. Is it too late to put Epsom salt on your roses now?
No. Go for it. They'll thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Uh-huh.
I have a question about sulfur.
Uh-huh.
You only use elemental sulfur, and is that for acidifying the soil, or do you sometimes add gypsum?
A gypsum really doesn't do all that much. So frankly, people think it does, but it really doesn't. I mean, it does to some degree, but just elemental sulfur. That's what I use.
Okay.
And that's for alkalinity, yeah, to get it more acid, yeah.
Right, I understand. Do you have any clever ideas about gophers and roots? First of all, are there some kinds of roots that are more resistant to, or less tempting, to say it that way, less tempting to gophers than others? Or do you find that they're all pretty much the same?
I find they're all pretty much the same. And I think if I had the answer to that, I wouldn't be sitting here. I'd be a multi-billionaire. people, people are, I have watched, I have friends that garden. Luckily, I am blessed without having a gopher problem because I garden in Pronghorn Ranch, which is a subdivision. I think the bulldozers scared all the gophers away or something. I have not seen one. I've seen skunks, I've seen raccoons. I have not had the gopher issue, but the people that I have seen that have the gopher issue up in the Prescott area, nothing seems to work. I have one friend who has gone so far as to set off sulfur bombs in their tunnels. She fell over backwards and hurt herself setting them off, but the gopher was just fine and laughed at her. She's done the cayenne pepper thing. She's done the trap thing. She went so far as to dig down like 4 or 5 feet and pour a concrete wall.
Oh, good grief.
Oh, wow.
Uh-huh.
That's
She
totally
impressive. It didn't work. They ate the iris anyway.
We had someone present on controlling gophers last week.
Okay.
And just my own experience is if you're willing to trap forever and ever, about 6 or 10 times a year, you can sort of make a dent in the gopher damage. But if you're not willing to trap, you can start, just oh, well, I didn't really like that rose very much anyway, and replace it with another one.
Yeah, exactly. I guess, we used to call that shovel pruning. You don't
Yes,
like it. It's shovel pruning, and now it's gopher pruning. You just, yeah. It's pretty much, yeah, gophers are a real issue. And so that's the raised bed thing, I think, is the best idea. And for all I know, maybe I do have gophers, but I don't think so because I got the veggie garden in the ground, and I've never had a problem up there. But the raised beds and putting that stucco hanging material on the bottom of it, or just hardware cloth before you put your raised bed in, I think is probably the only way that you're really going to get around that unscathed.
that's very good advice. So I have one, this is like a real serious rosarian question.
Uh-oh.
I have a contact in Santa Rosa who runs a
Yeah,
rose
there's a
forum.
category. Uh-huh.
And I've actually, visited her place, and one of the conversations I've had with her is that I have never been able to grow an own root hybrid tea rose to maturity in my garden.
Really?
And I asked her whether she had a similar problem. And in fact, I wrote a fairly long piece that I sent to her and posted on one of the forums that she um, mediates. And she said, actually, after reading it, she said, wow, this is one of the best rose pieces I've ever read. And she said, yeah, all of my hybrid tea roses on their own roots fail pretty quickly. So do you have any insights? Do you have similar experience or know of anybody who has similar experience? Or do you just not plant
No.
many hybrid tea roses?
Well, I do plant hybrid teas. I plant them both down here in the desert, and I plant them up in Prescott Valley. And obviously the ones in Prescott Valley are in raised beds. And I have a mix of David Austin's old roses, and I do have some hybrid teas up there, and
Uh,
they're all own root.
are they?
And I have not had that problem, and they're about 3 years old now, and I've not had that problem. And I've never had that problem even and I've had many, many, many hybrid teas, more hybrid teas down the desert than I do up north. Just my mother shares the house with us up in Prescott Valley, and she will not abide by hybrid teas very much. So I have more old roses up there. I sneak a couple in, but I have more old roses up there, and I have more hybrid teas down here, and their own root again. And I have not had that problem. One of the things that I would wonder about would be if they're coming from San Jose, California. I'm pretty familiar with that area, having grown up part in nearby. It's a much more temperate climate.
Yes.
And so I don't know if they're coming from there, if they're not, but I buy a lot of roses from Antique Rose Emporium, which is in Texas, Brenham, Texas, which is definitely a warmer climate, although they did get that big ice storm, so they do get some colder weather. And I also buy a lot of roses from Heirloom Roses, and they're up in Oregon, I believe. So and they're going to be colder, and those are all on root.
Yeah, in my experience, it's the David Austin roses
Okay.
and the ones that have a good connection with old roses, antique
Hmm.
roses, that actually will grow on their own roots.
Okay.
But hybrid teas, pure, real hybrid teas that aren't like Floribundas or something like that.
Yeah.
Part of it is probably because old roses will tolerate my general lack of care better than
Oh
hybrid
yes.
tea roses. So
Yes.
that's
Yeah.
that's probably part of the reason. But of course, the person I'm talking about lives in Rose Heaven and is a pretty good gardener. So I was just curious to see if our experiences were unique, and it sounds like they might be.
Yeah, and again, that's another thing. Antique Rose Emporium has a wonderful website, and they're very generous. Mike Shoup, the owner, is very generous with his information, and he's the guy who told me about the unstable surfaces for the deer.
Mhm.
His thing is found roses, old roses, roses that can just survive by themselves, scrambling along a chain link fence somewhere next to a road, and he goes and snips some and roots it, and then off. So these are roses that don't require a lot of special coddling, and so if people out there are looking for those sorts of rose experiences, I would say definitely check out what Antique Rose Emporium has to offer. They have really good quality plants, and they're very good and they're very supportive. They sell out quickly of a lot of varieties, but they grow constantly. So they have spring and fall shippings that they do. In Prescott, we're still early enough that they'll still ship, and all of these companies will still ship to us up there now. It's getting towards the end, like they're not going to ship after May. So then you have to wait till the fall. But that's kind of fun too, because then you can sit there and look at the different stuff online. You look at the people who still put out catalogs. David Austin still puts out a physical catalog, and you can sort of plot and plan and do a little research. Helpmefind.com is great because you can go out there. They do roses, clematis, and I forget what the other plant is they do.
Peonies.
Peonies, thank you. And you can go out there and you can go out there and they've got people all over the world sharing their experiences of growing these different varieties. And so that's very helpful.
Those are all really super resources. I buy a lot of roses, or have bought a lot of roses from Antique Rose Emporium. I've bought some very good roses from Heirloom Roses. And I've spent a lot of more time than I should probably ever admit to spending at Help Me Find. So all wonderful resources.
Me too. Me too. Okay, does anybody else have any other questions for me?
I just have a comment because I like that Dr. Earth product. And you can find them at Lowe's, which if somebody's looking, they have a good selection.
Yes, thank you for that. Yeah, because not every place does locally. Amazon also for people who order online. But thank you for that because yes, they do. It is kind of hard to find.
Can I ask you
a question? Oh, wait, Stephen, you want to finish?
No, please go ahead, Kathy.
So I have this porch that runs the whole length of my house. I thought it'd be beautiful with climbers all down the front, right?
Right.
So I bought from David Austin climbers.
Okay.
And my husband wouldn't let me plant them because he wanted to put the brick flower bed in first. So I parked them in a spot and they did really well and just kind of put some age on them and everything. And they were great. And then he got finished with that and I was ready to plant, but I did wait till they were dormant this year. And I moved 3. One's perfectly happy, not a hiccup, and the other 2, I don't know if they're going to make it. I had to cut almost everything off. It still has some green in some of the stalks. Is there anything else I can do? I put the root stimulant, fertilizer, everything.
Okay, well, the first thing is, what time have you planted them in the winter when they were dormant?
They were dormant when I did it, yeah.
What month was it? Was it when it was cold or warm or?
No, we were still having cold, yeah.
Okay. So it was like January, February, maybe?
I think it was February.
Okay. Yeah, I probably would have waited to plant a little later, but I mean, these things are pretty tough and they're probably going to be just fine if they've still got some green on them. I had a whole bed of David Austin roses, which are a lot of the pictures that I have in this presentation. And I had them down in my garden in the valley. And then I got the $1,400 water bill for 1 month. And so I had Master Gardener friends come down and dig most of my roses out and move them up to their gardens. And some of these were so big we had to cut the roots, to get them out with the pruners, okay? And not only did all the roses that we just mauled getting them out of there survive and thrive, but I now have a whole damn bed of roses coming back.
Oh boy.
I
just couldn't figure out how one didn't go into shock, just didn't even lose leaves. And
yeah, it's really hard to know. Are they all 3 the same variety or are they different varieties? Same variety. Okay, that's weird. I mean, obviously the one you put liked it better than the other 2. I would suggest doing some Epsom salts because that's going to help it take up the nutrients. So half a cup on Epsom salts on each one. And I would not use a chemical fertilizer. I would use an organic like Dr. Earth or Happy Frog. I would use something that's fairly, and I'm assuming that this bed was prepared, that sulfur was added to the soil to help with the alkalinity.
And And potassium.
And potassium and everything else. Okay, yeah, and then now of course your problem is you don't want to over fertilize it and burn them that way either. So I would say at this point I would do Epsom salts. I would do Dr. Earth, maybe like half a cup of Epsom salts, half a cup of Dr. Earth on each one because organic's much slower acting, takes much longer to get into the system, and it's going to help build the soil, right? And then just make sure your water stays consistent and sit back and see what happens.
Okay.
But if they still have some green, they're probably going to come back. I mean, mine came back from the dang roots, chopped roots at that. So
yeah, I couldn't figure it out because when you buy the roses, those roots are chopped, and these not much, and I dug it way out and just spread them, and I thought, oh, okay, I'm doing really well.
Yeah, well, I'd say give them a chance.
Okay.
They just may have been that they got a little more exposure to cold in the one spot where you put the other one just was a little more sheltered for whatever reason, or there was just a little more of whatever in the soil in that particular area.
I'm thinking maybe I over fertilized. Out of all your
Yeah.
suggestions, I'm thinking that's maybe what I did.
Yeah, so maybe just do Epsom salts for now and call it a day and see what happens with them.
Okay, thanks.
That'll help. Anybody else?
I have one question.
Uh-huh.
Why, excuse me, why regular Elmer's and not the Elmer's?
Oh, the wood glue? Because the wood glue one has some chemical preservative in it that'll really hurt your rose. It has different ingredients, and so some of the chemicals that are in the wood glue will actually affect your rose in a very bad way.
If I used wood glue, is there anything I can do?
Sure, just cut the cane back.
Cut it back. Okay.
Yeah, just cut it back.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
You're welcome. Roses are really tough, guys. They're really tough. It's really hard to kill these, as evidenced by my experience.
Anything else? Anyone else?
Thank you.
Well, this has been a wonderful, wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for coming in, reminding us of how easy and beautiful roses can be for the garden. It really is a topic close to my heart. And so for people in the club, at least 2 of the 3 of the documents that Emily has referred to are already online. The 3rd one I hope to get up pretty soon, but the slides that she presented today and one of the other documents you'll find online, and I will actually show you if you care. I'm going to reclaim host.
And thank you everybody so much for putting up with my ineptness with the whole Zoom thing.
Oh, I think it looked great.
Oh,
yeah.
Did great.
Very much.
Thank you.
It was my pleasure.
I'm going to stop
I'm
your
going
screen
out and buy
share.
Epsom salts tomorrow.
There you go.
And next I need to, okay, I'm going to share how you will find Emily's documents online. So you should be seeing something that says Alta Vista Garden Club at the top, okay. So
Yep.
you click on notices, or you hover over notices, you go down to presentations, click on presentations, and right now 2 of the 3 are up. One of them is All About Roses, which you will recognize because we just saw it, right? And another one is Caring for the Rose in Prescott, which is a handout that Emily had, so she referred to this a couple times.
Wow.
So you should all be able to now find all of the information that's on handouts online.
And that handout's a really good cheat sheet because all of the things I talked about with pruning are in detail on that handout.